So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the last part of the environmental management book by Mulvihill and Ali, or Ali, however his name is pronounced. These two researchers and teachers at a university in Toronto, Canada, which is why they sometimes have Canadian examples in their book. This morning, I'm going to be talking more about alternatives and the critique of environmental management. And maybe that's a bit of a misnomer of the title, because while they are still sometimes critical, they're trying to sort of paint a way forward or making a number of different suggestions about what would be possible as opposed to what they refer to as conventional environmental management. Now, unfortunately, on my screen, at least, the picture of me is blocking some of the text, but I've tried to make sure that in all the rest of the PowerPoint slides, in the upper right-hand corner, that there's no text there to reduce the risk of there being any sort of blocking, so that when you are looking at the recording, that you can see the entire text. So whenever you see during this lecture and in the PDF file, whenever you see anything in purple, it is not something which is specifically to the book. It's something which I am bringing up, or I am paraphrasing or rewording what they said in the book. Just so if you're going back to look at this afterwards, you can recall that purple in this course, Joe, that means not from the book, something else, or some sort of observation that I've made. So we can see that in the beginning of chapter 10, that the authors are asking whether we might need to have some sort of a reorientation, what we could call a philosophical reorientation when it comes to environmental management. And we have in previous chapters, when they've talked about lessons that could be learned from public health measures, lessons that could be learned from disaster management studies, and also how environmental management maybe needs to be grounded in environmental sociology also. But this is this issue about environmental management is usually pictured as something which is seemingly objective. And this is just the way things are. Whereas they're suggesting here that maybe we should start thinking about what should be. And that environmental management is sort of based on traditional business models, even traditional business models that have been modified a bit in recent decades. So should we be saying that it's not possible to be objective when it comes to environmental management, and that we have to accept that perhaps we need to have some sort of normative practice in it? And they seem to also be suggesting in the book that if we don't make this change, this orientation, then we're going to be stuck in some sort of very shallow sustainability. We're not going to get any further from that. And so they are being normative, perhaps. It depends upon how we're looking at this, where they suggest on page 115 that environmental management is, or they perhaps should say should be, a broad collective and collaborative endeavor, governance for sustainability. In some ways, this is a repeat of some things which they have talked about in previous chapters. And there are some students during previous years that have commented on the book that saying that they could probably have written a book that was 2/3 as long and it would have been good enough. I'm not going to pass judgment, at least not at this time. So some of these slides here that I'm saying now, they can be seen as to some extent a repeat of some things that they've said before. But then we're going to start moving to things that they haven't talked about previously in the book. And of course, all societies have to use resources of some kind, or we're reusing the resources that other societies have taken from nature. Even if we would have a society that could have a 90% circular economy and 10% where we still needed to get new raw materials, we would still be extracting some materials from nature, and we would still need to be returning some materials to nature in a way that would be not damaging to nature, or would have perhaps only short-term and localized damage. And to be able to utilize these various resources, we have to have an internal organization in society. And societies in the past have been generally not very democratic, generally not very participatory, generally not very fair, so to speak, if we look back during a long period of history where a few people organized society for their own benefit. However, what they're talking about, and this is something which can be brought up in an environmental economics course, if we think about an economy that would exist sometime in the future that had no externalities, in other words, we couldn't send costs away to something else, to somebody else, that the environmental and social costs of everything would be included in the price of the good or service that we purchase. And that is how some companies have been very successful a long time, is that they've sort of passed the costs on to somebody else. And the classical way, from an environmental way of thinking, is that you just bury the terrible waste in barrels in a parking lot someplace or underneath what becomes a parking lot. And then the money that should have been spent to take care of that, somebody pockets instead. And ultimately, somehow society in general has to cough up the money to take care of this, by which point in time, maybe it's become much more expensive because now we have contaminated soil and water nearby. And as they're suggesting, and I think that a number of us might agree on this, but maybe to varying degrees, that economic growth is sort of conventionally described. We can't continue with this. We have our planetary boundaries. We have finite limits. And we also have a problem which is increasing of where are we going to put the waste that is the backside of society. Even with very clever waste management companies that exist in a number of places around the world, we're still going to have problems with built-in obsolescence, packaging which can't be recycled, and so forth. And at some point, that shouldn't be the waste management company's responsibility. It should be somebody else's responsibility. So then they say, which they've essentially suggested before, that since conventional environmental management arose in companies pursuing a traditional business model, if we're going to have a new kind of environmental management, it's going to have to be developed within some sort of another kind of frame. And companies, somewhat progressive or ones forced by environmental activists, have been forced to adopt some sort of environmental management. They've been forced to understand that they have to come to grips with at least some of the environmental damage that they cause. And yet, despite all of this, we still have environmental problems. And of course, part of that is that there are a large number of companies around the world that don't practice any kind of environmental management, despite what the book has been saying before, that with globalization, we have some sort of a globalization of environmental concern. And with a globalized economy, companies working in countries which have a high environmental standard and maybe move some of the production someplace else are sort of just temporarily buying time, probably, until poorer countries are having higher environmental standards, more environmental legislation. And this we've also heard before, that because of their environmental problems can be, sometimes they are, sometimes they are not, but the argument that they have is that environmental problems are very complex and we try to simplify them. And in the simplification process, maybe we were ignoring some things that were important. I have a question here. What was BAU? Business as usual. We need to admit, the authors of the book suggest, that we can't treat the environment or nature or ecology in one part and society in another. There is an interaction there. And we can understand that interaction from how, if we're going to deal with resources, we have to have a social organization and society to also deal with the resources. And just looking at environmental problems means that we might exasperate or cause social problems someplace else. We solve an environmental problem in one place, we cause a problem which is maybe less environmental but more social in another place. So we need to look at both of these. And we have spent a number of decades tweaking. That's not the words they used, but anyway. And we're sort of running out of time now. It's time to roll up our sleeves, or it's time to sort of think a little deeper. I think we all can be more or less in agreement with this, although to the degree of how much we need to make changes in the economic system is perhaps an ideological question, which I'm going to try to avoid discussing here, a political ideological question here. So the question is it enough to make a drastic greening of the present economic system, or do we need an entirely new economic system, which is maybe some sort of left-right discussion there as well. Another problem that we have is that we are forced sometimes, as they suggest, to make decisions even though we are uncertain. We are forced to make decisions even though we might lack some kind of, as they call it, baseline data. And frequently, if you're going to make an important decision in an organization, you need to know about certain information several years in the past. Our number of employees, the amount of emissions, the amount of electricity that we used, and so forth. We need to have that kind of information, but we also need to know what kind of effects that our activities might be causing. Because ideally, when we have made our decision, whatever it is, even though there's uncertainty, that we could continue to measure some of this data or information to see if our decision is making an effect. If we don't have the data in the background, we have no idea for sure whether we made the right decision and that the decision is having some kind of effect. And good or bad, that's one of the advantages of having an environmental management system, because hopefully you have been keeping track of a number of key statistics in your organization during the period of time you've had your environmental management system, and preferably even the period of time before you had a certified environmental management system. I think the book is sort of ambivalent about environmental management systems, and I'll be saying something more about that as we continue here. And we have to also accept that we're never going to be able to make, in an area that's so complex, and we may have some uncertainty, and we may lack some data, we will never be able to make 100% correct predictions. We can see, now I'm not going to talk about climate change today, we can see that that there is a certain surprise during the last approximately 2 to 3 years on the part of some climate researchers that the climate system, the planet as a whole, seems to be affected by changes in the atmosphere a bit faster than they thought. So the general picture, we understand on what's going to happen and the general direction we're going without drastic changes to reduce emissions. So the predictions that the IPCC makes are never going to be 100% right, and we'll just have to accept that. And then we might want to use the precautionary principle to interpret what the IPCC reports say, and err on the side of being a little more cautious than saying, well, they don't know for sure, so we'll just wait, which unfortunately has been the actions of certain leading individuals in various societies for a long time. Something else which is brought up in the book, it hasn't been my ambition to be able to cover every single thing that they bring up, because that would make a much longer lecture, is that environmental management has largely become an area of expertise, and as they call it, a technocratic decision-making area. That would maybe be more that you have a number of people in government that make certain decisions, and they would be called technocrats. They're not politically elected, but they have become, or they are, experts. Some of you might get employed in a government agency sometime and be considered by students 20 years from now as one of those technocrats. Who knows? And what they're concerned about is that there are circumstances where environmental knowledge which experts don't have is not being used and is not considered worthwhile and useful. I read a few days ago an article that was talking about in Australia where they were asking the general public to make sightings of some animal because the scientists aren't able to go around and see everything. And then everyone who was interested could download an app and there would be a GPS connection, so you would know exactly when and where the animal was seen and take some pictures of it. And this was, and it was also that there would be people living in a particular area who would realize that, well, I see that particular animal very often here, whereas the scientist might not know for sure in a given place where it was most likely to see, to be able to make a count and to better understand the habits of this, whatever it was. You can read the article yourself. I can't remember. They seem to be, they have a point, but at the same time, there are environmental management tools or environmental governance tools that have been designed from the beginning to try to involve the general public. And as you will see later in the term, environmental impact assessments, at least the original idea behind it is that at certain points in the process of doing the study and writing the draft report and then having the final report complete, the idea is that the general public must be involved. And so this is sort of an exception to some of the things that they're talking about, but they sort of ignored talking about environmental impact assessment. As opposed to, yes, I would agree, the majority of the environmental management tools are more expert sort of driven and controlled. And we have one of these points in the book where sometimes they're a little fuzzy. They're not entirely clear. Environmental management versus environmental governance. And as we recall in their first chapter, they complained about that many works of literature about environmental management are not giving us a good definition. And now they are sort of falling into their own trap here, because how are we going to have a participatory environmental management and how are we going to have a participatory environmental governance? And they sort of are using the terms interchangeably. So if we try to pull them apart, and for the moment we look at environmental management as something which is that companies and similar organizations are doing, whereas environmental governments would be the sort of overarching responsibility that governmental organizations, the state at the national or local level or whatever, are sort of trying to move society in general in a particular direction. It's a management of society in a sense. Since companies that do have good relations with their stakeholders and see this as strategically important, they could identify a number of stakeholders and try to have these involved in their environmental management. Maybe not the core processes, but at least involve them some way to have some sort of participatory. And then it's perhaps more obvious to consider citizens, or particularly those in a local area that are affected by something. And again, that's an environmental impact assessment, which we will have reason to come back to later in the term. They talk about risk in this book, and we'll be talking more about risk and risk assessments in another course later in the term. Everything is sort of linked together. I forgot the order. It's 244E, where we'll be talking about environmental management systems and work environment and risk, whereas environmental impact assessment is the last course in the term, 243E. Yes, but what is considered acceptable risk? And citizens sometimes will say, particularly those that are more, shall we call them, environmentally activist oriented, they will sometimes think that no risk is the only acceptable risk. That because certain things are so dangerous, or there are certain things that are such a high consequence when something happens, there's such a great impact, that no kind of risk is acceptable. And then some of the experts will say, well, that's just not possible. And we can see that we need to prioritize our work with risk, as we will see in the coming course, the 244E course. But maybe that's important by having what is an EIA, an environmental impact assessment. And in Swedish, you call it a miljökonsekvensbeskrivning. And we make a distinction between the process and the report, which is generated from the process. And some of us, including me sometimes, are maybe not entirely, we might be a little sloppy, that we refer to the report and the process together. You can't have the report without the process, and the process is leading to the report. So in some ways, we can see the report as the culmination of the process. They talk about in the book something that they call anticipatory surprise management. And I hope everyone realizes that it's really, really hard to find a picture of a surprised person on the internet and to use that, because 99% of them, when you search for that, it's some sort of a stock photo that you have to buy. And I've been very careful here to make sure that I have the sources of all my photos here. And in some cases, you find them on a website and they don't say where the picture originally came from either. We want to try to avoid being surprised if we're going to have proactive environmental management, that we're looking towards the future. We're not just reacting to environmental regulations. We're not just reacting to stakeholder ideas and wishes and opinions, but we're trying to avoid future surprises. And how are we going to do that? Well, we need to anticipate certain things. And what are the things that we want to avoid? Things that right now seem to be unthinkable circumstances, which means that since environmental management has a tendency to not think far enough into the future in many cases, then at least what they're suggesting conventional environmental management is, then this is a change in way of thinking. Unexpected events, unknowable impacts, and this word unknowable we'll be coming back to in a slide. So how are we going to do this? Well, that might mean that we might need to reject certain routines. We might need to question an organization. How have we done something for a number of years in the area of the environment? Or have we somehow gotten stuck here? A causal loop diagram can be useful, but that's only based on things that are thinkable, expected, and knowable. So it's a sort of a question about what if this was going to happen. This would mean that management needs to be somewhat less rigid. We need to have systematic environmental management and environmental management systems, but that might impose a certain rigidity in environmental management, which goes against these ideas that are talked about here. So we might have a conflict here between people who want to enlarge the way environmental management works and those that are very interested in retaining their power in an organization, controlling the environmental management system. We could see conflicts in the future with this. So we need to go outside the box. We need to run into people and ideas that we might not have heard of before, which also suggests, as I'll be saying later on, that environmental managers in companies, if we assume that there's more than one, they should have more than one background. And managers in companies should not all have just gone to business schools, because they probably tend to be educated to see things in a particular way and to try to avoid unthinkable, unexpected, and unknowable. Now, how can we deal with unthinkable, unexpected, unknowable? Well, they talk about this in the book, and they give examples where this is actually carried out. And they suggest that the military in some countries, in some places in the world, from time to time, think up these seemingly unrealistic scenarios. And it isn't that they're sending out troops to deal with that, but they're sort of making plans for that. And there's the same thing that certain countries at certain decades in their looking at the rest of the world around them, they think, well, what happened? What would happen if X happened? No, that can't happen. Well, what would happen if it did happen? What would we need to do then? I'm sure that there are some people who have been thinking in some countries in the past, what would happen if country R threatened to invade country U? No names mentioned right now, but you get the point. And it isn't that suddenly you wake up on a Tuesday and see a lot of troops on a border and think, oh, what are we going to do? That Swedish troops were moved to Gotland very quickly seems to suggest that some people in the Swedish military had a plan. So a concept which they talk about here, and this is not unique to books about environmental management, it's also books having to do with management in general. And this is something which could be brought up in a business school that is supposed to sort of educate people to have higher positions in companies. And this is referred to as the black swan. Now, if you have read in the book, you know what a black swan is and why it's called that. It was 10 or 20 years ago, there was an author who brought this up as a metaphor. A black swan is an improbable event, and especially an improbable event that leads to a great impact. And it's a metaphor based on something which is beyond our normal expectations. And the reason for this is that in the past, in Europe, there were white swans and only white swans. Of course, you could see young swans before they got their adult feathers, that some of their feathers might look a little gray. But adult swans, they were white. And then, everyone in Europe thought that swans were white, and since the swans we saw were white, all swans are white. And then there are Europeans that arrived in some places in Asia or Australia or wherever it was, and suddenly, to their great surprise, there were swans that had black feathers. And this was an improbable event, because everyone had assumed that since all swans they had ever seen were white, then all swans were white, and they couldn't have any other color. It's a somewhat different idea to running across entirely unexpected animals, like when the British and French came to Australia and saw a platypus. You know, this animal that lays eggs, but it's a mammal and has a duck kind of bill in the front and swims in the water. And at first it was thought it was a hoax. That was an improbable kind of animal. But it was a different kind of improbable animal because we had nothing to base our expectations on. Whereas when it comes to the black swan, we have our expectations. And so at first we say there can't be black swans. It's impossible. Now, the discovery of black swans on the part of some Europeans didn't lead to great impacts. It's a metaphor that an author used at one point in time to talk about what happens when things go against our preconceived notions. So a black swan event is impossible to predict, say the authors here in this book and in what they're also relating to. However, they suggest that companies could be designed and the networks that companies are involved in could be more resilient. They could deal better with what are referred to as black swan events. And that would be, if we go back, the idea about flexibility and so forth, and being somewhat less rigid in the management structures in the organization. And they suggest that conventional environmental management is probably not ready for one or more black swan events. Here is another term which is brought up in the book: confirmation bias. And here we see 6 points. The text is small, so I'm going to jump. That there is a certain psychological bias. All of us are guilty of this from time to time. And this is just the way it is. Evidence tends to be interpreted only one way based on previous experiences, which we sometimes have no other way of doing it. When we begin our first interpretations, and we're following our preconceived ideas, then this increases the tendency for us to continue to interpret in the same way and therefore narrow our interpretation more and more. Human beings, unless they are extremely inquisitive, almost morbidly inquisitive, or unless they are researchers that have a particular area of study, and depending on their research, we tend not to look for anomalies because we want to have familiarity. It's more comfortable that way, as opposed to anomaly. And the authors of the book are suggesting we should be looking for negatives. We should be looking for things that don't quite conform to what we expect to happen. And that will be a way to have perhaps an early warning for a so-called black swan event, and it will be a way for us to act more anticipatory. And they say this, which it had been a while since I had read this and reminded myself when I read this. When we observe things, we tend to impose an order on our understanding. And we sometimes impose an order which is correct, or at least correct for the time being as we understand it. However, sometimes that we can impose an order on things which seemingly are not in any order is a way that it fools us into thinking that we actually understand something. The order that we have created may not be the only explanation, and we might have increasing difficulty to see all the alternative explanations because of point number one. And there might be another explanation that might somehow or some way be better, but we don't see that. Even though we are rather clever, we could miss that. We tend to want to have simple explanations of complexity, and this has served natural sciences and other sciences well. We have Occam's razor. If you're going to try to figure out which explanation, you should choose the one that doesn't require as many exemptions to the rule and so forth. And that has served us well. But sometimes maybe we are fooled into thinking we understand something we actually don't understand. And maybe we need to abandon making things as simple as possible and to accept a certain amount of complexity. The various kinds of events that we find unusual tend to get explained from preconceived ideas. The exceptions tend to be sort of pushed down. This is almost like Kuhn and paradigms and so forth, that we reach a point where there are too many anomalies in scientific investigation that we begin to question the models and theories and paradigms that we have. And we, as people and society in general, we tend to behave as if black swans do not exist, even though we know that there might be a black swan. If we would go back to February 2019, and if somebody said that maybe there would be students in universities that wouldn't be on campus, but still would be taking courses because of a pandemic, I think that the majority of people would think that that was a black swan. And here we are. There were just a handful of people around the world that saw far enough ahead, epidemiologists who could sort of guess what might happen, but universities by and large were probably not all that well prepared for what seems to be to some to be a black swan event. Of course, if you're a public health official, epidemics happen from time to time, so we shouldn't be surprised, even if they don't happen all that often. And now there's this part of the book having to do with uncertainty and unknowns. And I just couldn't help but put the picture of this former government official in the United States who held a press conference where he talked about unknown unknowns and so forth. And if you listen to the press conference in 2012, and I suppose it's on YouTube someplace, you hear it and it's sort of like, what is this guy talking about? He's just trying to squirm out of the fact that the United States did not find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq when the United States invaded Iraq, because somehow Iraq was related to Afghanistan somehow, and it was Al-Qaeda and the Twin Towers and so forth, and therefore we invaded Iraq. And he had this long discussion, which always means that whenever I read about these kinds of discussions in books, I get reminded of Donald Rumsfeld when he was speaking there. So he's not the source for this. An unknown unknown. No one is aware of this, and we don't know the likelihood of occurrence. Obviously, that's something that's just completely beyond anybody's idea here. Then there are what are referred to as unknown knowns. And I can hear him talking about this in the press conference, which is why I'm sort of half laughing here. We ourselves don't have any knowledge, but there could be others that do have knowledge, but we just don't know who those peoples are. So we know that there are some sort of known things there, but we can't grasp them because we don't have the contacts with the right people. or we haven't spent enough time studying something to maybe to uncover things that were unknown knowns and now have become known to us. It just doesn't sound good in English to talk about unknown unknowns, but that's the term. We can find events that we know could happen, but the likelihood is considered so small that we just ignore the potential event. So at some point, this becomes known, but then we make it unknown because we are ignoring it because of the likelihood of it happening being so small. I know this sounds a bit ridiculous, but I have to bring it up. It's in the book. And they seem to suggest that there are a number of things which are increasing the likelihood of some of these things to occur, for us to be surprised. Increasing interwoven natural and societal worlds, globalization might increase the likelihood of number two, they seem to suggest. We have too much data which is flowing around. We have ideas which are combined in feedback loops very quickly. What is this word? A meme? Overnight, something that somebody wrote, it just sort of spreads all over the world without thought of what's going to happen. I mean, that seems very harmless, but we can sort of see the metaphor that's taking place there. And that suddenly we can be very surprised. I read a book that I got as a Christmas present. I read that a few weeks after Christmas. And one of the things in the book was that there was a woman who was just before she was going to get on a flight to South Africa from the United States. She tweeted something in 2000, whatever year it was, when Twitter was maybe a year old. And what she wrote was poorly formulated and taken out of context. And she turned off her phone and she slept. And when she got off the plane in South Africa, there were people waiting to take pictures of her and put that on Twitter about how awful she was in what she wrote. And she had no idea what was happening. And when she returned home, she was fired because what she wrote was interpreted as being racist. But if you put it in the right context, perhaps it wasn't, which seems to be very odd. So an innocent kind of thing that can happen can lead to major consequences, in this case for a particular person, which is why we sometimes have to be careful what we write about in social media. It can come back to haunt us. So let's enlarge this to society or to a company in general. So how can we make black swans gray? That's one of the things they're talking about here. So the problem is that we usually plan for things that we expect. We're going to go on a trip. We expect the weather to be such and such. We expect to visit locations A, B, and C. We're going to meet up with some friends that will also be there at the same time, whatever is going to happen. We expect that we don't need to buy bottled water because, and so forth. And then we get there and we hadn't planned for some things that were unexpected. If you're going to travel any place right now, you might need to expect that restrictions in the milder form for some reason might show up again. Who knows what's going to happen? What you do not know is at least as relevant to decisions that what you think you know. So we need to expand the idea of how we plan for the future in management, in particular in this case, environmental management, to increase the likelihood of things that we consider to be black swans, that we actually sort of somehow start to see them. They're not so improbable here. I wrote here in purple that if we make our organizations too lean, and there's the idea of lean management that's been going on for at least 2 decades, that we have exactly the number of people to do exactly what we need to do and no excess number of employees. And it's also like just in time. We have no warehouse. We receive everything at exact moment we need to have, and we use our factory to produce whatever it is we have there. And so by leaning organizations and slimming them down, it probably makes it more difficult for an organization to deal with black swans. So we see how some of the management behavior that we have in organizations of making them more efficient by having fewer people might make it more efficient on an everyday basis, but less efficient when we have unusual events that occur. So we can see climate change, which I'm not going to, of course, say very much about here today. It seems as if a lot of companies and a lot of local governments need to be affected in a drastic way by the effects of climate change for them to wake up and to start planning. The classic example in my mind is that at one point there was a lot of flooding because of a downpour that lasted a long time in Copenhagen. And they had serious problems. It would have made sense then if Malmö, right next door, would have thought, gee, that happened to Copenhagen and they weren't prepared. Maybe we need to prepare something this. Maybe we need to have a plan. But Malmö didn't do anything until a few years later when Malmö was afflicted by the same thing. And then there was a plan. So unfortunately, it seems like you need to be affected by that. Gävle has had recent flooding last year. They should have realized that that will be a possibility in the future with climate scenarios, but they don't seem like they were prepared. So every municipality that says they are prepared for future climate change, I doubt that. So I've been talking too much here, or I've had too much to say. So I had intention to have a discussion, but now we have to have a break, right? And then we can have the discussion. So we need to stretch our legs for 10 minutes, I hope, and then we'll come back to the discussion. I think for some people, the COVID-19 pandemic was a black swan, and for other people it wasn't, and that there were others that were somewhere in between, a sort of a gray swan. I certainly, when in December, hearing about an outbreak in Wuhan, I didn't immediately order FFP2 masks. A book in 2010, The Black Swan, The Impact of the Highly Improbable. And it's not, as I said before, it's not just environmental management, that contemporary business management, at least in some courses, in some universities, in some business schools, that they bring this up. But I don't know how central they make that in some of the courses. So even though a manager of a company appointed by the board of the company might have heard of the idea of a black swan event, he or she may be more conditioned by thinking about getting a good profit in the next quarter or something like that. But when it, so personally, when I first started hearing something about mysterious disease in China starting to spread, it sort of, in my mind, quickly became a gray swan, but then I didn't actually behave the way maybe I should have to begin with. So let's all assume that the rosy predictions that Omicron was the last serious variant and we can return to normal will be the case. But on the other hand, that may be perhaps wishful thinking. Nothing else anybody wants to bring up? They do talk about the difficulties of doing this. But they don't come up with a clear solution, because I think what they're suggesting is that the situations can be so different that it can be difficult to give a sort of clear one-size-fits-all answer. If we think about everyday life, I and my wife, we in the bank own the house that we live in. And then there's always the question of, should the interest rate, should we have a mortgage with a variable interest rate, or should we sort of lock that? And if we should lock it, should we lock it in place for 2 years or 5 years? And this is uncertainty. And we all, if we've been following what's been talked about on various media and perhaps social media, no one knows for sure how long we're going to have higher inflation, which is probably going to press up the interest rates. And some people will, in hindsight, be able to say that, well, I was really clever. And even though it was a little more expensive in the beginning, I changed my mortgage to a 7-year loan. And then after 6 years, interest rates started falling again. And it was obvious at the time. No, it wasn't obvious at the time. And others might think, well, it's going to be a temporary event lasting 18, 24 months. So I'll just have my interest rates in place for 2 years and then everything will be okay. And then some of us sort of don't know what to do. And I know I have to, my wife and I have to make a decision rather soon during the spring about what we're going to do. And we don't have sufficient data. Another kind of thing is that you can have some of your government pension system where you can choose where it's going to be placed. And some people have been very clever and got a very high degree of return on that. And other people who have made decisions haven't. And those who have made those decisions and have let the one fund take care of your money, 10 to 15 years down the road after it all started, they are doing better than average. But there was no way of knowing that to begin with. And that's one of the things about economics. It has to do with the psychology of expectations and, of course, what has value and so forth. So we have to sometimes just make decisions, even though the situation is uncertain and we have insufficient data. And we will try to then think of, I have several possibilities, which seems to be the least worse, perhaps, is the way we would do that. And in terms of an organization, if we're thinking about sustainability, I don't know what the best decision is, but clearly at least this decision here is bad, because it's going to ultimately lock us in something which won't let us change in the future, perhaps. That would be one way of looking at it. It's based on the best known knowns with the presumed least risk. If you wait too long, then you may be forced to make a decision which wasn't good. Continuing on, I'm going to show most of the remaining slides, but not all of them. What they say also at one point to recall here is that when there is a change from what they call conventional environmental management to more progressive or more alternative or emerging environmental management, certain things that have been developed within environmental management, some of the tools that we have, they will be continuous. We'll keep using them. They're useful. Or we don't have an alternative yet, so we keep using that until we have something else. In other cases, we might need to have what they're talking about is a discontinuity, that there'll be a break, that many companies were doing particular things in a particular way, and then they realized that an alternative way of dealing with this will require some sort of a break with conventional environmental management. So it isn't just that we all wake up on a Friday morning and say, oh, next week it's going to be alternative environmental management, and we'll have our employees work extra hours on the weekend. There'll be some sort of a gradual transition that needs to take place. And they suggest in some places that we can see some companies in some circumstances that have begun some sort of gradual transition, but they're very much in a minority here. And they talk about the need for scenario development and how this can be used to explore a less shallow and perhaps a deeper sustainability. This is sort of in line with the article by Lauerbach, where they're talking about sort of a twin track, that we continue doing certain things and we experiment on the side with other things. And then if the experiments turn out okay, then maybe that influences what we've been doing already in the area of environmental management. And through experimentation and collaboration with others and building networks, we gradually change things. And they also talk about weak signals. And that's one of my favorite concepts, regardless if it has to do with the environment or not. I always think it's fascinating, the idea of weak signals, and personally. So I'll get to that in a bit. Here we have some things in purple, which I'm sort of commenting here. It isn't that we should say toss out everything that in the two-page table that Lucas has in an article, saying that, well, all of these things were developed within a conventional idea of thinking about businesses and the environment. No, I'm sure that in 20 years' time, in 50 years' time, some of those will consider to be that they have been a continuity from conventional environmental management to an alternative environmental management. So I think that we shouldn't just discount them, or it should be a resource, that a table like that or an updated table that may come along at some point in time is useful for somebody that will be working with environmental matters in a professional way in the future. At the same time, there are a number of ideas and thoughts and experiments and so forth that have been developed as an idea, but not really developed as a practice, that came up within conventional environmental management, which still have not been attempted to be done. And this, Lucas doesn't include, for example, extended producer responsibility, which I'm going to talk more about later in the term. That's sort of like the story of this lecture. You have to wait, things will come back later. So we should realize that we can be slightly critical of chapter 12. We don't have to follow all the advice or the sort of recipe for success that's there to carry out experiments, and start moving in the direction. There are some ideas that are still around that haven't been taken up and tried to make into some sort of practical solutions yet. I bring up extended producer responsibility because in Sweden, we talk a lot about producer responsibility, producentansvar, but that's an extremely watered down version of what is referred to as extended producer responsibility, which, if companies are going to follow that, would lead to quite a lot of changes in the way they do things, but still probably within some sort of green capitalism. Or maybe it will lead to further developments. We don't know yet because it's not really been used. When it comes to scenarios, what is a scenario? And they say that it's essentially a story about the future. And it isn't a story that somebody just sits down and makes up in 15 minutes. A scenario is something that requires a lot of thought and probably requires the input of a variety of people to create the scenario if it's going to be a good one. And if a scenario is going to be strong and useful, it has to be plausible. I mean, what's the ultimate black swan event? In the year 2027, the planet Earth is visited by creatures from another solar system. I mean, that's the ultimate black swan event, right? Something like that. It has to be engaging. It can't be boring. It has to somehow have connections to people that are then looking at the scenario or have the scenario that they can use it. And it also has to have some sort of relevance. And that's difficult, as they write in the book. It's difficult to have a scenario that is plausible, engaging, and relevant. It might be plausible, but not so engaging and not entirely relevant and so forth. They say, well, why isn't there so much interest in scenarios? And why, particularly in the contents of this book, why aren't processes of making scenarios for sustainability in organizations more common? Because if we have scenarios for a deeper sustainability, then that would quite quickly suggest areas where our conventional environmental management is lacking. And so there seems to be a resistance to making this kind of activity a sustainability scenario, or the scenario is made, but it's decided by upper management or the owners of the company. Let's not go there quite yet, but we have ourselves ready there. And they give examples of science fiction or fantasy where these are all scenarios. These are all stories of a future, or in some cases, maybe stories of a past, if it's some sort of magical fantasy or something like that. And I'm sure that some people in this course have read some kind of science fiction or fantasy or seen a film that many of us have done that. And these are not very plausible, so it would seem. And yet, some of the films are very engaging. Are they relevant? Well, and so the question they're asking here is that if people can become so caught up in these things, which are in a sense a story, then why aren't sustainability scenarios more interesting and a tool that could be used more often. I think it's because personally, well, also I'm writing there, I'm not sure that the author's argument here it holds all the way, and we have to be able to criticize our course literature also. I think it's because of those kinds of scenarios that become a story form that have actors and so forth. They become so engaging that we put aside the idea of it being plausible, and we just sort of accept the unlikely in that. So we have a number of scenarios in front of us. That's sometimes what is done is that you have several scenarios and you consider the different scenarios and what that might mean. And you might pick a hybrid of several of those and start to plan based on those. If we're thinking much longer term, if we're thinking more outside the box, if we're willing to think more about a deeper kind of sustainability. And here we can see a diagram where it seems as if there were 4 scenarios. It had to do with the Baltic Sea. These pictures had no credits. They just sort of appeared on these pages. And when you tried to find who made the picture, ultimately, there was no credit for it. So something more, they talk about scenarios. Besides the fact that they need to be plausible, engaging, and relevant, it also is that there seem to be 3 main types of scenarios: predictive scenarios, normative scenarios, and explorative scenarios. And I have written that explorative scenarios are neither of the above, but that's not quite right either. But it was a way that I tried to simplify the PowerPoint slide. A predictive scenario is based on things that we think are likely. So predictive scenarios tend to be more based on where we're standing now and looking towards the future. Or normative scenarios are more like, what would we like things to be in the future? And then we have to think about what do we need to do in coming years so that something approaching that scenario, because that's what we want, what we consider to be desirable, or something that we want to avoid. We want to stay away from that as much as possible. An exploratory scenario is usually thought of as not being based on, it's of course difficult to do this based on the present day and not with something that's desirable, but very open-ended. And through the establishment, the exploring, the creation of several different scenarios, some of them we might decide are desirable, some of them we might think are more likely, some of them are a mix of that. But rather, as we can expect, Mulvihill and Ali are suggesting that predictive scenarios might limit us because it's based on where we are now, that it might be a bit based on business as usual, as opposed to finding something that is desirable. I've added on here also that generally speaking, those that write a lot about sustainability and sustainable development, they at some point, sooner or later, talk about learning for sustainability. And it's not just learning for sustainability in schools, but that organizations and people in organizations don't have a clear picture of what sustainability necessarily is. They have an idea, and as they begin to pursue something that they hope is like sustainability, they learn some new things along the way, which influences what they think sustainability is, which influences their goal, which influences their actions, and so forth. And this becomes impossible to predict. So sustainability should be seen as something as more of a cross between a normative scenario and exploratory scenario. And we can then think back to Kuhn again. Are we talking about a paradigm shift here? Is conventional environmental management and alternative emerging, whatever, are they incommensurable as sort of ways of dealing with environmental issues in organizations? We could argue for and against, and I think the authors of the book are sort of on the fence. They're sort of saying yes and no and so forth. They don't want to come clearly down there. And of course, one of the reasons is that they don't know for sure. If they knew for sure, they probably would leave the university and get employed someplace else and earn more money. And then this little quote I sort of love also is, the purpose of the scenarios is to prepare us for what we think will not happen. Something desirable might not happen unless we take action. It's unlikely it will happen. So therefore, we have to do something so to increase the likelihood that it's going to happen if we consider it to be desirable. Now, in the book, you can see that there is on one of the pages, and towards the end of the book, I don't have the page number here, that based on Schwartz, that they take his or her, I'm assuming for the moment it's a he, but it could very well be a she. They take Schwartz and they take the 4 components in a scenario exercise, and they try to orient this with sort of titles and so forth underneath each of the 4 components to make it more sustainably oriented. And this is just an example that they're using as what one could use to create a scenario. So with our scenario, we're not predicting and controlling the future. That's not possible. Instead, they argue, based on other researchers as well, we take our present actions or our present lack of actions, our present goals and so forth, and we evaluate them in light of the scenario. So that would be taking sort of a more normative perspective and then seeing what we're doing and see what we may be doing wrong or not enough of or whatever, and then modifying that accordingly. What we're doing now, or is this enhancing progress towards a deeper sustainability? This is my words, but as I'm sort of paraphrasing what they're saying. Or what seems to be correct right now is actually correct in a narrower definition of sustainability, but the more we pursue the narrow definition of sustainability, the more barriers and difficulty there will be that we put up to make a switch to something which is more deeper sustainability. And it's really hard to know unless we have done this sort of scenario exercise, which is why most people say, well, how can I know that? Yes, it's difficult to know, but if you haven't done some sort of exercise like that, which is in fact something that maybe we should do scenario exercises in a couple of courses in a different way than what we've done already in the program. The question is where that would be. It probably shouldn't be the first term. And here we come to weak signals. And one of the reasons I like that, like the idea of weak signals so much, is that years ago when I read the book by Rogers, Diffusion of Innovations, and I've included at the bottom the last version because this researcher, I don't know, about 10 years ago passed away. So no new book by him, but I read a version that came out in the 1990s, I suppose, the 3rd or the 4th edition. And it was the strength of weak ties, that sometimes that explains unusual innovations, unusual diffusion of innovations, because he and his graduate students had studied all kinds of innovations and diffusion and processes and tried to sort of develop rules for that. And the common one that everyone talks about, of course, is the S-shaped curve for diffusion of innovations, that almost all diffusion of innovations take place along an S curve. But this isn't a course about that. And I don't know if you run across this otherwise anywhere in the program. So what we see is that we are drowning, all of us, in various kinds of signals. And I thought I'd use a sort of a Wi-Fi on cell phone kind of signal thing. Or maybe it's we're drowning in noise. And it's difficult to hear these weak signals, either as individuals or as organizations. And since it's still COVID-19 time, we all heard of something happening in Wuhan at different times before the pandemic struck Sweden. And we attached importance to that weak signal in varying degrees. Everyone who bought the masks privately before some of us tried to go online and buy the masks, they were very attuned to weak signals, or at least particular kinds of weak signals that the rest of us in varying degrees were not attuned to. Now we have the problem here. Not all the weak signals out there are something that we really need to pay attention to, but instead we need to follow the weak signals Is there a weak signal which isn't disappearing, even though we think it should? Maybe we should pay attention to that. Or is the weak signal growing in strength, that when it starts to grow in strength, we're ready to do something, as opposed to being much later along when some people maybe start reacting to it? There's also a term called corporate intelligence or corporate social intelligence, the degree to which companies, corporations can pick up on weak signals and hear this a little earlier. It isn't necessarily picking up on a trend among consumers, but other kinds of signals. So we don't have to find the right weak signals. We really can't do that, but we have to be prepared to listen often enough and note whether there's a signal which we think should disappear but hasn't, or that it seems to be growing slightly stronger. Those are the things that maybe are the ones that we should consider to be important. At least that's what the book seems to suggest. And so in sustainability, because it's so broad, and I'm writing this in purple, we're going to need to have people with different backgrounds, because they're going to be more perceptive to certain signals than other people. So preferably, if you're going to be several people that are working with environmental management or sustainability in an organization, let's say that one of you here, I see Saga there, in a way, you probably don't want to have a colleague from this program working with you. You probably would want in the future, you probably would want to have somebody from another program, and not necessarily exactly the same, more natural science oriented, or something which is an environmental, but is social oriented, but has an environmental concern as well. That you and others would be able to perceive these weak signals a little better, because you have different points of departure in how you sort of listen. On the other hand, if you try to encourage people from the same university program to join the same place, then you can come to agreement very quickly, which can be advantageous in some cases. And as I said before, there is this risk that there is a tendency in many companies that people who attended business schools, in Swedish you would say en handelshögskola, and they got a very similar kind of education regardless of which handelshögskola, school of management they went to. And then that means that there's a risk that you have a group of people like that that perceive the world around them in a similar way, and therefore they miss certain weak signals entirely. Which is another reason why it's good with diversity, people with different backgrounds, different academic backgrounds, different social or ethnic backgrounds, or whatever, in organizations, if they're large enough, so that we have a diversity of ideas. And they give an example of weak signals from the natural sciences and from ecology with invasive species, as an example. I don't know why they didn't take so much of an example from society, or maybe there was one, but I just skipped over it. So we've reached the end of chapter 12. What we see is that when environmental management was young, shall we say in the 1990s, health and safety practices that existed already could form one of the sources of inspiration and ideas to work with environmental management, but it also depended upon the particular company. And environmental management systems, a tool of environmental management arising after environmental management, but it originally thought as a way to improve and systematize environmental management, had quality improvement, and quality management is a source of inspiration. And the authors of the book suggest that since this has sort of been established, shall we say in the late 1980s into the 1990s, and had a period of success, what's happened is that conventional environmental management has stagnated. And that's again my point with the article by Lucas, that there are a lot more things that could be done within the ideas of conventional environmental management. And then we also have the risk. We do need to have environmental management systems, but there is a risk that they freeze environmental management into a very slow but thorough way of moving the company forward. There's a lot of debate among practitioners of environmental management systems that have connections to universities that say that, well, yeah, we need to have it, but sometimes, and it has led to improvements, but sometimes I'm frustrated by us moving slower. On the other hand, if we didn't have an environmental management system, we might not have done anything at all, but we have environmental management systems to talk about that later. Somebody sent me an email, I think on the weekend, about environmental management systems and should I do and stuff like that. I will answer that hopefully later today here. So what we see also is that throughout the book, there are a number of ideas, theories, models, and so forth that anyone, given the possibility of having a position to deal with environmental management, to advise the top management in a company, or to perhaps be in a sort of an internal management group where you could sort of rejuvenate, to bring more life into conventional environmental management. And you could potentially nudge it more in alternative directions. They have in their last chapter 8 principles. I'm not going to bring that up because we have reached the end of the allotted time. But the PDF lists the principles, and I have a point at the bottom of the principles being listed there to add to that. And if there had been time, there were some questions that could have been used for discussion. You can look at the questions yourself if you'd like. And then I had some sort of comments. Now, imagine that 2 years from now or whatever, that you get a job as an environmental manager in a small company. What are some sort of advice from this old guy who was the environmental manager in Lund University for a few years? So based on some practical experience, how can you do what's expected with you, but also try to nudge the organization a little bit further on? So I had some sort of, I don't know if they're wise, but they're ideas to sort of leave you with